Welcome back to the E Pluribus Unus Mundus series of papers. This is the third video in the series, and I'll be discussing parts of the third paper, which is called Natural Law and the Holographic Empyrean. So the title of this video will be MLK, Natural Law Theory, String Theory, and Angels. So I'll tell you how that works. The overall series is intended to help bring the left and the right of the United States of America together by adding two amendments to the Constitution. The first being to identify each individual psyche with a gravitational singularity and the outermost horizon of the cosmos. And the second amendment would be to add a fourth branch of government to help the other three unite with each other through this worldview that equates the psyche with the singularity. So this series of videos about updating the Constitution is based on what I've discussed in this book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. So the main point was that Carl Jung, the psychologist, who discussed the concept of the collective unconscious mind, worked with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who helped develop quantum theory. And together they said that there should be a mirror symmetry, parallels between the laws of psychology and the laws of physics if mind and matter both emerge from the same fundamental source, which, quoting an alchemist from the Middle Ages, Gerhard Dorn, they called the Unus Mundus, the one world. So this entire book and these related videos about updating the Constitution, they started on July 4th, 2010, when I was writing a paper. I was getting a PhD in philosophy and religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And on the TV was a television show, Through the Wormhole, with Morgan Freeman, and this one was about the black hole war between Leonard Suskind and Stephen Hawking. So I've discussed this in the previous two videos. The bottom line is, according to Leonard Suskind, all of the information that falls into a black hole and is erased from the universe, from the perspective of someone who would follow it past the event horizon, is simultaneously conserved on the outermost sphere of that black hole, the event horizon, where the fabric of space-time is collapsing towards the central singularity at the speed of light. Beyond the event horizon, space-time is contracting to the singularity faster than light. So not even light can escape a black hole. But if you're watching from outside the black hole, you would see every bit of information gets smeared out around that outermost sphere of the black hole as if on a holographic film and leak out with the Hawking radiation. So there's a lot of details here, and I've discussed them in the previous video, so I won't get into them too much here. But one of the fundamental points is, according to Suskind, the universe is an inside-out black hole. So where space-time is expanding away from our perspective on Earth, in every direction, it seems as if space-time is expanding away from us, and when that expansion rate reaches the speed of light, that's called the horizon of the cosmos, or the cosmic horizon. Leonard Suskind says, the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe are conserved at each point there as if on a holographic film, and then they radiate in with the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang, on these fundamental elastic threads of energy, to create this holographic movie, a cinematic hologram of natural history unfolding through three dimensions of space along a linear time dimension. But that's an illusion, says Suskind. Now, it's important to keep in mind Leonard Suskind is an atheist, or at least he presents himself as such. I think he sometimes says, well, I don't say there's no God, I don't say there is, I don't even know how to fathom the question, but at any rate, he presents himself as someone who has come up with an antidote to what he calls the illusion of intelligent design, the idea that there's some kind of a cosmic intelligence orchestrating things, such as all of the constants of nature required for life. He says, no, there is no such cosmic consciousness. Nevertheless, when I was watching this show Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman, it reminded me of the near-death experience that Carl Jung talks about in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he said that he had a heart attack in 1944, and it seemed to him that his consciousness rose above his body 1,000 miles above the earth. He could see the continents below him, clouds. He encountered a big black rock boulder hollowed out into a temple. And the bottom line of his near-death experience is that it seemed to him as if the past, the present, and the future are interwoven at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, and that here in the three-dimensional world we are all imprisoned in these little boxes of illusion that are hung up to the horizon by a thread. That's his words. So there's the parallel that Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli were looking for. In my mind, I saw this holographic string theory says the past, present, and future are interwoven at the outermost horizon of the cosmos. They radiate in on fundamental threads to create this cubic illusion of three-dimensional space. That's exactly what Carl Jung said. Okay, so another thing that Carl Jung said is that he realized that the ultimate archetype of the collective unconscious mind, from which all of the other archetypes emerge and toward which they all strive to return, he called that the archetype of the self, also known as the God archetype, also known as the Unus Mundus, and that's the title of the series. And he says the image that emerges spontaneously from this underlying archetype is a mandala, a circle or a sphere with a central point. So, if the mandala is the image that arises from the self archetype, specifically when a psyche is pulled between opposing demands, irreconcilable demands, such as the United States is suffering these irreconcilable demands of the left and the right, pulling farther and farther apart. At that point, Jung, who says that the collective psyche follows the same laws as the individual psyche, we should expect compensatory mandala imagery. So the mandala image emerging from the self-archetype should be mirrored in the world of physics. And in the book, Psyche and Singularity, I say a black hole is nature's perfect mandala. It's a perfect sphere with an actual point in the center, a singularity, a mathematical point. So for this series of papers, I'm saying, if it is true that the mandala emerges to unite opposing demands in the individual and in the collective psyche, the situation in the United States of America today is perfectly suited for triggering these kinds of compensatory mandala images. And I suggest that the parallels between Jung's psychology, which culminates with his idea of the archetype of the self and the mandala images that arise from it, he says this was the greatest insight of my life, and Leonard Suskind's string theory of black holes and the inside-out black hole universe, when you superimpose Suskind's physics onto Jung's psychology of the self, I believe that that is the basic framework that is emerging at this time to compensate the collective consciousness of the United States of America. So I know that these concepts, string theory and Jungian psychology and natural law theory, they're difficult to grasp. You have to put forth some mental effort. It's not always entertaining, but this video with Martin Luther King, natural law theory, string theory, and angels, I thought, well, angels are interesting. Most people seem to be interested by angels. I was looking through on let's see here, a Gallup poll. 89% of Americans believe in God. This was a Gallup poll, June 30, 2016. It was this article that I'm reading here. And 72% said they believe in angels. 12% said they're not sure. So belief in angels, belief in God, that the majority of Americans, unlike the majority of people in Europe, who are also given asked these same questions, do believe in angels. Okay, does that seem superstitious? Does that seem primitive? I do not think so. I believe in angels. I've never encountered an angel, or at least I don't know if I have, but this entire idea of the horizon of the cosmos being this holographic memory bank of the universe, and the way it so perfectly mirrors not only Carl Jung's near-death experience, but so many other theologies and philosophies of the past, including Plato and the Vedanta philosophy. And Eben Alexander will be looking at this Harvard. He used to, I don't know if he does anymore, but he used to teach at Harvard Medical School as a brain surgeon. He had a near-death experience that converted him from an agnostic to someone who believes that God is the universe and he loves everybody. And he mentions experiencing angels out at the horizon of the cosmos. So does Carl Jung. He said after his near-death experience, then for 3 weeks afterward, he would wake up at midnight, and for about an hour, he would have these ecstasies where it seemed to him as if he was one with the universe, and he would experience angels, he says. So I'll get into that. But my point is that to update the Constitution, we need to learn about, I believe, Jungian psychology and holographic string theory. String theory is important because it unites general relativity, the theory of gravity, and quantum mechanics. And those two languages of physics have been at odds, and they still are, because string theory has not been empirically verified. The strings are too small to see. They're down at the Planck scale. But I say that the way Suskind inadvertently rediscovered this ancient cosmology, and especially coming in the Platonic academic tradition, where Plato pointed this out in the Timaeus and in the Republic and the myth of which is a near-death experience, that is in some respects empirical evidence that Suskind string theory is emerging from the same archetype of the collective unconscious that these philosophical and religious worldviews have emerged from. And that to this day, people who have near-death experiences like Carl Jung, like Eben Alexander, and many other people who aren't medical doctors like they were, but there's just this continuous stream of evidence to indicate that our consciousness is interwoven with all of the information from the past, present, and future of the entire universe, specifically out at the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where, furthermore, other beings with higher intelligence also live. So I'll discuss how this is related to natural law theory. And so my hope is for a lot of people who would say, well, it's good for you. You're trying to bring the left and the right together. Okay, but it's just too boring and it's too dry. It's never going to work. It's never going to capture the imagination of the American people to inspire them enough to invest the mental energy you require to understand what you're even suggesting. Well, when you throw angels in there, I'm hoping that will intrigue some people. And Eben Alexander's, the way he discusses that the sister, he was an orphan, he was adopted, and one of his biological sisters whom he'd never met, he says he encountered her, or an angel who looked like her. It was her, he says, but then I was looking, for angels, and for whatever reason, Denzel Washington came up. He said he experienced as a child what he thought was an angel. It looked like his sister, but then he noticed wings, and ever since he's believed in angels. So the majority of Americans believe in angels. Angels are very interesting, the entire concept. And I think when you put it in the context of the synthesis of Jungian psychology and holographic string theory, it becomes a lot less superstitious sounding and a lot more scientifically grounded. and then we'll talk about Aquinas and Augustine, and they were no intellectual weaklings by any stretch. So with that, so I took some notes down here about where I want to start. So here's this third paper. So I've talked about these two amendments, and here I'll just read a little bit. So at the beginning, in this third installment of the E Pluribus Unus Mundus series of papers, I argue that an amendment installing the equation psyche equals singularity as a preface to the preamble of our Constitution would not violate the First Amendment, which states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Rather, it would provide a scientific foundation for natural law theory, which is the philosophical presupposition of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so this is a big point I make in these papers. To add to the Constitution the claim that psyche equals singularity, does that violate the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof? Is it a religious claim to say that we are all one with this omnicentric singularity, this omniscient, omnipotent, essential point, because it has a lot of the characteristics of God? Even Pope Pius XII said so in 1951, which I discuss in this third series of the paper, this third edition of the paper. So then I talk about, you can word this amendment to say that even if you don't believe it's true, for the sake of having a common definition of the self, this is still a good working definition that can help us ground the philosophy of natural rights upon which our entire Constitution is based. So it can be worded that atheists can still say, okay, but for the sake of argument, when you have people trying to discuss their points of view reasonably together, you have to have some common definitions. So if we define the self as the gravitational singularity and its encompassing horizon, I'm saying that is the mandala image of the archetype of the self, which has this which inspires this instinctive compulsion to unite opposites. That we need more than just a conscious plan on how to get back together and stop hating, projecting shadows each on the other. And this archetypal image, if we could incorporate it into our Constitution, I'm saying it would have the effect of uniting the opposites instinctively. The problem is you have to develop this image in the collective mind. Enough people have to see it and concentrate on this one common point that unites us all, and that takes a sufficient amount of mental effort that most people, I don't think, would want to put up without a good reason. Why should I? So hopefully some of these points that we discuss will be interesting enough to spark some more conversation about what I'm proposing here. All right, so here's the Declaration of Independence, where the idea of natural rights, the laws of nature, and the God of nature. So this is all related to MLK. Then we're going to go to Aquinas, Augustine. I'll read a little bit from Eben Alexander and Carl Jung about angels and the holographic horizon. All right, so this is the famous Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, so the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle people to and endow us with certain unalienable rights. That is the Declaration of Independence. So wouldn't that declaration of the existence of God and the laws of nature emanating from God who endows us with rights, that seems to violate the separation of church and state that's in the First Amendment? So it's been argued no, because they didn't mean by religion belief in God. They meant the founders of the nation, the writers of the Constitution. They meant the idea of God to them was a reasonable postulate. It seemed self-evident to a reasonable human being. So that's not religion. Religion was, different denominations of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever, tradition of divine revelation and historical events on particular humans, that's religion. But the abstract concept of a creator God creating laws of nature was not considered religion. So that's something I talk about in the paper. Also, the self-evident truths were not obviously being applied in the United States at the time. So there was the self-evident two-facedness of the founders. All men are created equal, and yet there's slavery. All men are created equal, yet women can't vote. All men are created equal, yet even white men who don't own property can't vote or run for office. So clearly there was hypocrisy right there in this founding document. Nevertheless, the ideal has guided the nation over the centuries through a bloody civil war, through various amendments to the Constitution, to live up to this birthing ideal of the laws of nature and of nature's God, entitling everybody with certain inalienable rights and in a way that we're all created equal. So the point is that for us now in the 21st century, how do you define laws of nature and of nature's God? It doesn't seem as plausible to many people today as it would have back then. To the deists, these were deists. A lot of the founders of the authors of the Constitution were not strict dogmatic Christians. Some were, but some were completely agnostic regarding denominations of religion, but believed in an architect of the universe who designed nature. All right, so the laws of nature and of nature's God, that needs to be discussed. So now I'm going to move to the letter from a Birmingham jail, which is on, I believe, page 27 of this third paper. Let me go down there. Okay, so here is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister, doctor of theology. So, letter from a Birmingham jail. He was arrested in Birmingham. He was doing a peaceful demonstration against segregation. He was marching despite the fact that he didn't have a permit to march. And he was responding to an article that other white ministers put out saying, stop breaking the law, we can use the court system to overcome the evils of segregation. So he wrote a letter in response to them, dated April 16, 1963. Okay, so he says, you express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. I'm going to skip down a little bit, and he says, one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. All right, so I'm going to go back over the pertinent point for this video. How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? So he says, to put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. All right, eternal law and natural law. So I'm just looking at my notes here. We're going to, so on page 10, is where I start to quote from Thomas Aquinas. Summa Theologica, 13th century theologian in the Catholic Church, the angelic doctor of the Church. He's responsible for most of the Catholic dogma today. So here, on page 10 of this third paper, I say, in a nutshell, natural law theory states that even without the aid of direct divine revelation, quote, the light of natural reason, unquote, so this is Aquinas says we have the light of natural reason, can discover that a perfect and all-powerful God must have created the universe and the eternal law of nature that organizes it. All right, so the eternal law is the laws that with which God governs the universe, the laws of physics, but also the laws of psychology. They cannot be broken. Natural law is when humans use the light of natural reason to discover God's plan for nature, and in particular, to discover the natural inclinations with which human beings are implanted. And whatever desires we have by instinct, that means God gave them to us, which means they're good. Reason can analyze the orderly nature of the universe, and from that infer the existence of an all-powerful and all-good creator God. Whether you agree with that or not, that's what Aquinas says. And furthermore, human reason can discover the difference between what is morally good and evil. A morally good action is one that aligns with the natural inclinations with which God has implanted the human soul. And an evil action is one that goes against that natural plan. So let me just read a little bit here. For example, we can use reason to discover that we have a natural right to pursue our instinctual desires to survive and procreate, says Aquinas, because those natural desires are aimed by God toward their proper goals, and it is good to conform to the goals God prescribes for nature, while it is evil to stray from them. So here's a quote from Aquinas. Hence it is that all those things to which a man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reason as being good, and consequently as objects of pursuit, and their contraries as evil and objects of avoidance. So, whatever we have a natural inclination to is good, and whatever goes against those natural inclinations is evil. We have a natural inclination to survive, the survival instinct. So it's good to survive. And from that you can derive the right to life. It's right for us to want to live. Therefore, it's evil for someone to violate your desire to live. Now, there's certain circumstances in which that becomes reasonable. For example, if someone's trying to kill you, then you have a natural right to protect your instinctive desire to live, but this is the root of this idea of natural rights. It's rooted in the idea that God has implanted us with our desires. The desire to procreate is good because we have it and God created us. The Catholic Church would say, therefore, sex that's not for procreation is evil because it goes against the goal that God implanted in us. Now, that's a very controversial point, and in the paper I say, you don't have to accept the Catholic application of Aquinas' natural law theory to accept the philosophical presuppositions of it, which is that you can use reason to infer what natural rights are by analyzing the instinctive inclinations of the human mind. What makes this theory more plausible is the fact that the idea of these absolute ideas of God's mind, which you find in Plato's philosophy, and in Plato's philosophy they also say, he has Socrates and other characters in his dialogue say that these absolute forms of reason from which the temporary three-dimensional forms radiate, they exist specifically out of the outermost sphere of the universe. In the Timaeus, he says that he calls that the mother substance. So these absolute archetypal forms, for Carl Jung, that's the collective unconscious mind. They exist out at the outermost sphere of the universe. That, where string theory says that's where the past, the present, and the future are interwoven and they radiate in on fundamental threads, that's consistent with Plato's theory of absolute ideas, from which he says this three-dimensional illusion is projected. But it's also consistent to say that that's where the angels live. And this is what I think will attract more interest than a lot of the other things. And now I've already been going on this video for a while before we get to the angels. But we went over the basics of natural law theory. For Carl Jung, the archetypes are correlated with instincts. You have an archetypal image, and it has an instinctive pattern of behavior behind it. Now, these archetypes, if we see them existing out at the outermost horizon of the cosmos, then that gives us some kind of a grounding for natural law theory, because the instinctive inclinations of a human being that with which God implanted us, if we interpret God as the God archetype like Carl Jung did, and if we equate that with the central singularity and the horizon of the cosmos, then we would see then that all of these absolute ideas, like the absolute idea of justice, the absolute idea of equality, the absolute idea of beauty, they're interwoven out at that outermost sphere. This is where God's mind is. So St. Augustine took Plato's cosmology, he fused it with biblical theology, and that's what he said. Where Plato said these absolute ideas exist, Augustine says yes, and those are the ideas in the mind of God. The outermost horizon is the mind of God, but he also called it our mother and the mother city, and this is where God resides, and this is where Jesus exists. And he has the idea of the spouse of God, but it's also where the angels live. All right, so I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit. So now I'm going to click down into the end notes on this third paper here, and I'm just going to read a little bit more from Thomas Aquinas. So I will just read about the Empyrean. All right, so the following excerpt about the Empyrean. The Empyrean is this outermost sphere, which I'm correlating with what Leonard Suskind describes as this holographic information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. It's the outermost sphere from Suskind's perspective, where space-time is expanding away from the Earth at the speed of light. Traveling at the speed of light affects space and time in a way that it freezes them. So that becomes this universal memory bank. So this is the following excerpt about the Empyrean comes from the first part of the Summa, so that's Summa Theologica. Question 102, man's abode, which is paradise. Article 2, whether paradise was a place adapted to be the abode of man. So Aquinas puts forth a claim, and then he puts forth objections to the claim, and then he answers these objections in order. So here's a reply to objection 1. The Empyrean heaven is the highest of corporeal places and is outside the region of change. By the first of those two conditions, it is a fitting abode for the angelic nature, for, as Augustine says, God rules corporeal creatures through spiritual creatures. Hence it is fitting that the spiritual nature should be established above the entire corporeal nature as presiding over it. By the second condition, it is a fitting abode for the state of beatitude, which is endowed with the highest degree of stability. So beatitude is, in the Catholic dogma, after the resurrection of the dead. Where will you exist? In the state of beatitude, in this transfigured state. So thus the abode of beatitude was suited to the very nature of the angel, therefore he was created there. But it is not suited to man's nature, since man is not set as a ruler over the entire corporeal creation. It is a fitting abode for man in regard only to his beatitude, wherefore he was not placed from the beginning in the Empyrean heaven, but was destined to be transferred thither in the state of his final beatitude. Carl Jung and Eben Alexander definitely felt themselves transferred to that state of the final beatitude during their near-death experiences out at the horizon of the cosmos, where they both encountered angels and all sorts of beautiful experiences, and specifically the past, the present, and the future they experienced at each simultaneously, which is a very big point for holographic string theory. And Augustine says the same thing about experiencing past, the present, and the future simultaneously out at the horizon of the cosmos. All right, so I just want to read a little bit more about how Aquinas says the angels exist out there at this outermost sphere. So these comments come from the first part of the Summa, question 61, the production of angels in the order of natural being, article 4, whether the angels were created in the Empyrean heaven. So there's objections saying that they were not. And then he replies, on the contrary, Strabus, commenting on the text, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, says, by heaven he does not mean the visible firmament, but the Empyrean, that is the fiery or intellectual firmament, which is not so styled from its heat, but from its splendor, and which was filled with angels directly it was made. So this intellectual fire, it's not hot, it's the splendor. Leonard Suskind would say it's infinitely hot. If you had a cable long enough from the earth out to the horizon, the thermometer would read infinitely hot. Although if you were traveling out with the flow of the expansion of space-time, you wouldn't feel that kind of a heat. This is what he calls cosmic complementarity, the different ways you experience the horizon of the cosmos depending on your position in the universe. But at any rate, here we are continuing with Aquinas. I answer that, as we observed, or as was observed, Article 3, the universe is made up of corporeal and spiritual creatures. Consequently, spiritual creatures were so created as to bear some relationship to the corporeal creature and to rule over every corporeal creature. Hence it was fitting for the angels to be created in the highest corporeal place as presiding over all corporeal nature, whether it be styled the Empyrean heaven or whatever else it be called. So Isidore says that the highest heaven is the heaven of the angels, explaining the passage of Deuteronomy 10:14, behold, heaven is the Lord's thy God, and the heaven of heaven. All right, then he goes and he replies to various objections. But his point is that the angels live out at this outermost horizon of the cosmos, and that they rule over the corporeal world of bodily forms. All right, so I want to now read a little bit from St. Augustine. Now, I didn't include as much detail in this paper, but so this is from the book Psyche and Singularity, and I've got page 88 and 89. And this is just about Augustine writing of the heaven of heaven. So in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. He says, why did they use the word the beginning? Every other event of creation has on the first day, on the second day, on the third day. How come this vague word in the beginning? And he says, because God created heaven and the earth, that meant the heaven of heaven, which is talked about in Deuteronomy, and the earth meant this primal substance from which matter could emerge. So what is this heaven of heaven? And he says, I assume that it is because by heaven is meant heaven of heaven, the intellectual heaven, where it is given to the intellect to know in one act, and not part by part, not to know now one thing, now another, but, as has been said, to know in one act without any succession of time. So you know everything immediately, past, present, and future, in the heaven of heaven, this intellectual heaven. Where he goes on to, so in the Timaeus, Plato has the astronomer Timaeus tell Socrates, he describes this outermost horizon as the mother and receptacle of all created, invisible, and in any way sensible things. And similarly, Augustine, he calls this heaven of heaven, there was then a created wisdom created before all things, the reasonable and intellectual mind of your pure city, our mother, which is above and is free and eternal in heaven. And he says that that's where the angels live. And he explains that the angels don't have to read the Bible because they have God present directly to them. So the supercelestial hosts of God's angels have no need to read the Bible, for their book is yourself, and you eternally are, because you have established them above the firmament, which you have established above the infirmity of the peoples below, and there they may look up and know your mercy. So the angels live out in this intellectual city, the spouse of God, where God is indwelling in every point. That's where the angels are, and that's where Aquinas says the human beings are transferred in the state of beatitude. That's where people who have near-death experiences recall visiting. So I discussed Carl Jung. So here is the book by the neurosurgeon Eben Alexander, Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife. I discuss it in the book Psyche and Singularity. But for this video about natural law and angels and string theory, so he had E. coli bacteria, gave him a case of meningitis in which his brain shut down completely, and yet despite his complete, the paralysis of his brain, he experienced wonderful experiences, the more vivid than anything he's ever experienced while he was consciously walking around on the earth in his three-dimensional form. And the way he describes his near-death experience is very similar to Carl Jung's. It supports this idea that the past, present, and future exist at this outermost horizon, which he equates with God. But I just want to talk a little bit about the angels, because they're there too. So when he found himself rising from this earthworm's eye view, he calls it, and he would transfer across this beautiful meadow where these celestial people were dancing, and beautiful flocks of butterflies that could have this intellectual kind of ESP power. He would see them streaming everywhere. It was this idyllic dream world, he says, but it was more real than anything he's ever experienced. On one of the wings of one of these psychic butterflies, he met this beautiful woman who seemed to him to be his guardian angel. Later he found out, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, that it was the same face and personality in a transfigured form of his biological sister, whom he had never met because he was given up for adoption. But later he found a photograph, he was given a photograph, and he recognized, oh, that's the girl. But here's what he says about angels. He mentions them several times in this book. But meanwhile, I was in a place of clouds, big, puffy, pink, white ones that showed up sharply against the deep blue, black sky. Higher than the clouds, immeasurably higher, flocks of transparent orbs, shimmering beings arced across the sky, leaving long, streamer-like lines behind them. Birds, angels, these words registered when I was writing down my recollections. But he says neither of them do justice to the beings themselves. Later he says, I think what people call angels are these orbs that have this, they can communicate to you, they have higher powers of knowledge, they live in higher dimensions. So he says, a sound huge and booming like a glorious chant came down from above, and I wondered if the winged beings were producing it. So they were filled with such joy that they had to sing in these choruses of beautiful music that he'd never heard before. But the point is that near-death experiences, people frequently recall encounters with angels. So here's Carl Jung's book, Memory Streams, Reflections. So he had his near-death experience, and then for 3 weeks after, he would wake up for an hour around midnight, and he would say, everything around me seemed enchanted. At this hour of the night, the nurse brought me some food that she had warmed. He would see a blue halo around her, and he felt like he was in the garden of pomegranates, the Kabbalistic tradition of the mystical marriage. He says, gradually the garden of pomegranates faded away and changed. There followed the marriage of the Lamb in a Jerusalem festively bedecked. I cannot describe what it was like in detail. These were ineffable states of joy. Angels were present in light. I myself was the marriage of the Lamb. So that's also what Augustine calls the horizon of the cosmos. Jerusalem, the pure city, the spouse of God. All right, so MDR 294. All right, so you know what? I think I've gone over all the main points here. So the goal of this series of papers, as I'm recommending 2 amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America. The first is to equate each of us, each individual self, with the omnicentric gravitational singularity. It's a point of infinite density. It contains all of space and time. And it's also surrounded by a horizon, specifically the horizon of the cosmos, where the past, the present, and the future are interwoven at each point, and from where they radiate in on these fundamental threads to create the cinematic hologram of three-dimensional space. That parallel between Jung's psychology of the self and the mandala images that it produces and the near-death experience that he had, the parallels between that and Leonard Suskind's atheistically presented holographic string theory perfectly fulfills the prediction that Jung and Wolfgang Pauli made about searching for parallels between psychology and physics. It also indicates, according to Jung's criteria, that how do you know if knowledge is coming from an archetype? Well, first you see if you have it spontaneously emerging in dreams and fantasies. See if you have, if your peers are experiencing similar things, and then look in the records of history to see if people in the past have had it. Well, if you look in the record of history, such as Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, St. Augustine's Confessions, and many other religions, as I do in Psyche and Singularity, Plato's Timaeus, the Vedanta cosmology, the Katha Upanishad, for example, is a near-death experience of a Brahmin boy named Nachiketa. This holographic string theory, which unites general relativity and quantum physics, at least theoretically, is this perfect match for this medieval and older, even more ancient cosmology. The difference being, Suskind he rejects the idea that there's consciousness out of this horizon of the cosmos. Nevertheless, he says all of the information that would create conscious beings is there, whereas the Platonic, Vedantic, Christian worldviews say, no, it is conscious. That's God's consciousness. It's the mind of God. That's where the angels live. The angels help control the universe. And that's where humans go in their state of beatitude. And that is what people like Carl Jung and Eben Alexander said that they experienced, and countless others. All right, so that will be enough for this third installment of E Pluribus Unus Mundus.